Thank you, Paula, for reading. Always a pleasure to have you bring the word to us. This passage that she read begins in an interesting place. I wanted to begin with that phrase, as in Paul's version said, when the way they were filled. In the version in the pew you have is when they were satisfied. So when they were filled, when they were satisfied. When we are satisfied. We look at things a little bit differently in life when we feel satisfied, don't we? It changes our perspective. I found this really to be true when you go grocery shopping. You don't go grocery shopping if you're really hungry. It's like, ooh, that looks good. Oh, yeah, I want that. Oh, yes, this is pretty soon. Your budget is blown and your cart is much fuller than it needs to be because everything looks good and you're hungry. And so you put it in the cart. It changes things in us when we're hungry, when we're dissatisfied. Not just our moods, but we can chemically change as well. Especially this is true as we deal with this passage where they were fed. When we're hungry, we chemically change. Our brain begins to starve, and we change. How many of you have ever been hangry? Have you heard that term? Hangry. I'm hangry. I'm hungry, angry. I'm hangry. If you're hungry, you get cranky, right? You get irritable. And you're not always the most pleasant people. I'm guilty of this. I get so involved sometimes in projects or what I'm doing, I'll skip a meal, and pretty soon I get kind of cranky. Don't ask my wife about that. If you haven't eaten, your blood sugar drops, your brain becomes irritated. You start snapping at people. Think about those times you've been at a restaurant and you're hungry and you're waiting and it takes forever to get seated and then it takes forever to get your water and then it takes forever to have someone bring you a menu and then it takes forever for them to notice you. You're not very happy, are you? The more hungry you get, the longer you wait, we get irritated. We get hangry. So we're much more pleasant, much more rational when we're fueled up, when we have what we need, when we're satisfied. And so after Jesus has fed everyone, 5,000 they say, they gather all the scraps from what was left over, and people were fine. So let's go out and pick up all the leftovers. People were satisfied and said, sure, take the leftovers. We've had enough. They were in a good place, ready to share, give back what was left over, and they had gobs of leftovers, baskets. And so even when we're satisfied and we're filled up, we become a much more generous people, much more willing to share. This word, this Greek word, eneplestheson, or from the root epipleme, is to fill up, to satisfy. And it's not just used for food. It's used in the scriptures for filling up the heart, fill up the heart with love. Filling up, God satisfies our soul. And so it's to be filled, to be completed, to have enough, and to be glad in it. That is how this word is used. The issue today, of course, is that we often do not know when we are satisfied, or there are so many messages out there telling us why we shouldn't be satisfied, or that we don't have enough, or that we need more. And we have to filter those messages sometimes that come at us constantly that says, you need the next and new thing, or you need more, or we don't have enough. And some of these messages can cause us then to be this kind of anxious, irritated, hangry people who don't feel like we ever have enough. And many people are angry today. There's a lot of angry speech out there. People dissatisfied with the way things are, or what they have. And especially this weekend, after we saw just a tremendous plunge in the stock markets. It hurts. It causes anxiety. And it can leave fear that we won't have enough to last our lives. We constantly live with our satisfaction being challenged. being thrown into doubt. And so it's hard for us to feel filled up. Well, this Sunday by the Presbyterian Church is designated Public Education Sunday for the church, to remember public education. It's something that the Reformers strongly believed in. John Calvin believed that all children in Geneva should have access to education and work towards that goal. John Knox, John Calvin was his mentor, also took that back to Scotland. So it's always been part of the Presbyterian Church. There's no question that the Presbyterian Church has had a disproportionate to other denominations amount of teachers involved in the denomination. It's a church and a denomination that's always believed in education and being educated and learning. It's no doubt that one example of that is that my title in the Book of Order, our Constitution, is teaching elder. We have ruling elders, we have teaching elders. My role is to help teach the Word, teach the faith, and the confessions. But public education has not always been the norm. It was brought up because education was something that only those who could pay for and afford were given. And so the Reformers and the church worked hard to establish public education where anyone can have access to being educated, to having their intellect filled, having their mind filled, having their possibilities filled and satisfied. We are aware that public education is not perfect, it's not completely equitable. We are more aware than ever that depending on what district and what city, that some schools are better funded and do better than other districts, and there's still work to do to have a completely equitable education for all people. And even within our country, we can feel dissatisfied, but we look outside into other places and we see there's a long way to go for many places where education is not available for many. And in fact, Presbyterian Women and the Horizons focus on that as well, global education for all people, and it's part of the missions. It's in this year's Horizons publication to focus on global education. And we're going to get a chance to do that in October when we invite Vida Gill from Presbyterian Education Board in Pakistan, who works to do that, to bring education to all kids, to all people, regardless of their religion or their gender and faith. And so education is something that we work towards. It's a value, and we use all the means that we have to ensure and help people be educated. People discover their possibilities to learn and have more doors open to them. So we keep working. But the question today also now is not, as we heard in my announcement, not just education, but then what about access to health and healing? To be able to have health care is a question our nation is grappling with and not agreeing with, and how that is done. But I think everyone agrees that there's something broken about the system as it's been. And I can tell you that that's true, and we feel it here in this church, as every year since I've been here, only 2, we've had to raise the number of hours that our employees have at the church to qualify for health insurance, and their deductibles have gone up, and it's hard to see that when they are just trying to make it. And so something, as we gather together, we see there's a great dissatisfaction when it comes to health care. Our denomination has a health care plan for clergy and those who are involved in it that is based on percentage, so that the more that is paid, the greater is paid to the health care program. That is so that those who aren't making as much can afford it. Their deductibles are also lower. And that's a system that is also being challenged by the rising costs of health care, and the denomination is dealing with it. Presbyterians have always believed in trying to reach people, give people health care. We have Presbyterian hospitals throughout our country that were started with the mission of trying to bring health care to those who couldn't afford it. And yet, as things changed, those had to separate from the values of the church to become separate institutions. and grapple then with being able to still complete that mission of providing health care for all. And many denominations, many different churches, the Catholic Church and many Jewish hospitals have also had that part of their mission, to try to bring health, because as Christians we see that Jesus brought healing to people. And so we continue our conversation about how we bring health and healing to people in our country. People had followed Jesus. In the beginning of the passage that we read the end of, it said that Jesus, by the thousands, people were following him because of the healing work he had done. They said, Jesus is healing people, and they followed him. It said, Jesus said to Philip, it said, a large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus was healing people. And so they come to this mountain, and it was the Passover that was coming soon, and they looked up and saw the large crowd, and so Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip said, "Well, we don't have enough money. It would take 6 months' wages and that wouldn't even buy enough bread for each one of them to get a little bite." And one of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "Well, this boy here has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But how much is that among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." And there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And then as Paula read, they were satisfied, and there were baskets and baskets left over. The popular understanding of this event is that Jesus magically multiplied the amount of fish and bread so that there was way more than anyone needed, a supernatural miracle. That goes along with the theology of Jesus as one who satisfies all our needs, where we say Jesus is the answer to all our problems, who will just supernaturally make everything right in the world and in our lives. If that doesn't match up with your understanding, there is another way to look at this passage, because it doesn't say exactly what happened. It doesn't say it was a supernatural miracle. It just says that Jesus started with a certain amount of loaves, and then at the end, there was a great deal of more. What some scholars think might have happened, in my opinion, is a much greater miracle. Jesus showed the generosity of a little boy, willing to give up what he had. And people saw that generosity. These are not dumb people. They don't venture around without anything to eat. There aren't McDonald's on every corner. They had food. Many of them would travel with food, commonly dried fish and bread. What they saw then was that in one act of generosity, perhaps they stopped hiding and clinging to what they had and joined it, shared it with others. And what we found is that maybe some had none, maybe some had a lot, and they brought it, and they all took what they needed and shared the rest. And there was much left over. One act of generosity gave to another. They ate, and they were filled, and they were satisfied. This lines up with a theology of discipleship, where Jesus didn't come just to show miracles and do things for us, but Jesus came to raise followers who would act as Jesus acts, who would be generous, who would love, who would be out and heal and care for people, feeding people. We cannot supernaturally produce food, although I never have. I think Christine does. But we can be generous with what we have. I imagine many of these people were worried to share. What if I don't have enough? I need to hold on to this. It's scarce. I work for this. And they cling to it and they clutch to it. And maybe some didn't share. Maybe some in the crowd kept what they had. That fear can creep in and keep us from ever feeling satisfied and squash generosity. Because it's difficult. We aren't wired to be generous. We're wired to survive. And surviving means holding, storing, keeping, making sure that you're taking care of yourself. Even the wealthiest of the wealthy, when polled and questioned, always answered as they felt they needed more, that they didn't have enough. And strangely enough, even the richest of the rich say there's always somebody they point to that's richer, that has more. They compare. And there was a common thread of anxiety that they might not have enough. Not too long ago in the news, this CEO of a Seattle-based credit card payment processing firm, Dan Price, announced that he was going to raise the company's minimum salary to $70,000 a year. He was met with a lot of enthusiasm, but he was also met with a lot of criticism, saying, "What are you, a communist?" He just wanted to be sure all his employees had enough. And it meant that he had to cut and reevaluate how much he needed as a CEO. Just this last week, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, voted that public companies had to disclose the pay ratios of CEOs and the median pay of their workforce. That's going to be interesting to look at. How much is enough? How will we ever be satisfied? There's a lot of clutching, there's a lot of hiding going on, or desire to hide, and nobody ever wants to believe or really ask, do we have enough? Or how much is enough? It's interesting that the silent generation who lived through the Depression, who lived through a time where they barely made it through, grew to be one of the most generous, more stable, giving generations that our country has seen recently. They learned, perhaps, that they could survive with very little, and they could afford to be generous. Interestingly enough, they also became one of the wealthiest generations of any of the generations now. I think we have enough to satisfy the needs, basic needs of people in this world. But it has to come collectively together, each giving from what they have. And we as a congregation try to do that, work with other churches to collectively support organizations in Corvallis that meet the needs of others. Whether it's giving financially or working in volunteering at Stone Soup or other organizations in cold weather shelters. We collectively try to bring what we have to be generous so that others may have enough. Of course, the greatest challenge of all of this, of what is enough, is that people can still, when they have what we might consider enough, not be satisfied. And so it's not enough just to help meet the needs. I think that's part of the Christian mission, but also always in front of us is the mission of helping people be satisfied, not by what they eat or by their possessions or by their services, but to be satisfied by the love of God. To understand that the greatest gift that we have is love. The love of God, but also the love that breeds and grows among community. I imagine at that place, on that grassy place, as people ate, as people realized they had enough, and they perhaps shared, and whether you believe it was a miracle of spontaneous production or people sharing, but people had enough and satisfied, that people relaxed. People started talking to each other. People started caring for each other. And communities started to build. And it just awed them so much that they wanted to grab Jesus and make him king, because he had done a miracle. And the miracle wasn't so much the supernatural sort. It was a miracle of bringing people together, showing them that they do, that we do have enough. We have enough to share, to give. So let's keep giving, keep loving, and trust in our God.